Good morning. I'm Larry Goodson of the Department of National Security and Strategy, proud member of Seminar 13. That's the new version. The old version I'm also a proud member of. I'm serving as director of this year's regional symposium as the professor of Middle East Studies, and this year we are focused on the upheaval and change underway in the Arab world. Events of the last year that have come to be known widely, in the West anyway, as the Arab Spring or Arab Awakening. This year's symposium follows in a tradition now almost a decade old, where the War College community pauses for a couple of days in the middle of the year to explore a region in a focused fashion, trying to gain or deepen familiarity with what is occurring there, why it is occurring, and what it means for the world in general and U.S. foreign policy in particular. Having just given you an overall introduction to the concept of our symposium, my remaining tasks this morning are to cover a couple of administrative details, to offer some words of welcome and thanks, to provide a more specific framework for considering the remarkable events of the Arab Spring, and to introduce Dr. Fawaz Gerges, my friend, our keynote speaker. First, the administrative details. I won't burden you with our schedule for the next 2 days, as all the information you could ever possibly want is available on the Regional Symposium portal on the CBNet. However, I do want to point out, I was told to point out, that this event lasts 2 full days, and tomorrow morning's session begins at 0800, and that is correct in this. It is incorrect on the electronic version of the calendar. Okay, so if you've got your paper pocket calendar, it's correct, 0800. Generally speaking, the format is that each session will begin in Bliss Hall with the speaker or panel of speakers, be followed by time for Q&A, and then conclude in the morning or afternoon in the seminar room. Before my other administrative details, let me welcome our special guests here today. As David mentioned, in order to widen the impact of our symposium, we extended invitations to the other colleges and universities in Pennsylvania, as well as other governmental organizations and academic institutions that are farther afield, to encourage them to send faculty and/or students here. I want to welcome all of those folks here, and they're scattered around, and also to lay an injunction on them. Please do not be merely passive observers of this symposium. Please engage our speakers, and especially when you go to the seminar rooms, please lend your expertise and insights to our seminar discussions. You heard from David about the Bliss Hall lobby meeting point for the regional symposium, so I'll skip over that. I'll just say, again, thanks to the visitors for attending, and thanks in advance for contributing to our understanding of the Arab Spring. Also, I want to thank Southern Company's charitable foundation, whose contributions through the Army War College Foundation have helped make today's keynote presentation possible. And in particular, I want to point out that representing Southern Company today is Mr. John Pemberton, right over there, Senior Vice President and General Counsel of Southern Company's Operations and Southern Nuclear. Thank you very much, sir. Now, a quick introduction to this year's subject. In February, a protest movement in a major capital city prompted an accidental overreaction by security forces, widespread deaths, and a wave of revolutions that ultimately swept across a continent. I'm referring, of course, as my historian colleagues here in the room will undoubtedly know, to February of 1848 in Paris, and the resulting revolutionary wave that swept across much of Europe became known to the world as the Springtime of Nations. What caused those protests and upheavals? widespread dissatisfaction with the political leadership and calls for more democracy, the socioeconomic demands of the working classes, the rise of nationalism were all key factors. A century and a half later, the Autumn Nations occurred in 1989 when Polish strikes, the Tiananmen Square protests combined with Mikhail Gorbachev's glasnost in the Soviet Union to spark civil disobedience, velvet revolutions, and even violent overthrow of regimes throughout Eastern Europe. In November of 1981, the Berlin Wall fell, symbolizing the end of an historical era which thousands of people around the world commemorate with little pieces of the wall, such as this chunk right here. In December of 2010, Mohamed Bouazizi, a Tunisian street vendor, set himself on fire in protest of mistreatment by a Tunisian official and her aides. His death subsequently catalyzed protests in Tunisia that toppled the government of Zine Ben Ali in January of last year, followed by protests elsewhere in the region, most notably in Egypt, where they prompted the ouster of Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak in February 2011. And so it went across the Arab world, as virtually every country saw some protest or made preemptive reforms to forestall upheaval, with governments falling or coming under enormous pressure in Libya, Yemen, Bahrain, Syria, and elsewhere. This springtime of Arab nations, or Arab awakening, represents a powerful and compelling event that, as I hope I have just illustrated, only comes along occasionally in world affairs. It is indeed rare when many people across numerous societies find themselves captured by the same problems and compelled to express their grievances in such a public and cataclysmic way. We had 1848, then 1989, and now 2011. Moments such as these are rare in human history and deserving of our close attention. It is thus fortunate that we have such a distinguished, internationally acclaimed expert on the Middle East to start us off today. Fawaz Gerges has been here, what, two times now, 3 times maybe in the past, in the last decade. He's now professor of Middle Eastern politics and international relations at the London School of Economics and Political Science, or LSE as it's widely known. He also holds the Emirates Chair of the Contemporary Middle East and is the director of the Middle East Center at LSE. He earned his doctorate from Oxford University and before that his master's from LSE, and has taught at Oxford, Harvard, and Columbia, was a research scholar at Princeton, and is still a chairholder at Sarah Lawrence College in New York. He is a prolific and widely sought-after speaker and author. I think he's written probably a half-dozen books since 9/11. And I just want to give you a snippet of his latest book, The Rise and Fall of Al-Qaeda, which just came out in the fall. And I read, "The democratic virus is spreading and creating a new language and a new era of politics in the Arab world, an era in which Arabs and Muslims will not allow a small, misguided minority to seize their voice. In this new landscape, Al-Qaeda and like-minded factions will lack the oxygen to survive, unless, of course, the democratic promise is aborted and legitimate grievances are not met." And he goes on from there. It's actually even more interesting from there, but I think he's going to give us some of that just now. And so thank you, Fawaz, for joining us, and we'll all welcome Fawaz to this stage.
Thank you. Thanks, Dan. Thanks. Thank you. Good morning. Thank you, Larry, for the invitation. I'm really delighted to be back here. Yes, and it's my 3rd time. It's a great privilege. Larry has asked me to really lay out the context of what has happened in the last year or so. In particular, since it's the first lecture, he wants me to talk about some of the drivers and the causes of the Arab awakenings, the meanings of what has happened over the last year, and also to conclude by putting some ideas on the table. That is really what's happening in Egypt today, in Tunisia, in Syria, in Yemen, in Syria, and in other places. Just tentative ideas, and I hope you know we are speculating a great deal, truly, because the situation is very dynamic, very evolving, and that's really sometimes even the administration has to adjust continuously to what's taking place in the region, in Egypt, in Tunisia, in other places. But I think I want to start where Larry really concluded his remarks, is that regardless of how we view what has happened in the Arab world in the last year, truly, what has happened represents a significant historical moment, not just in the history of the region, I think in the history of the world. And I'm not exaggerating, but I will lay out my arguments in a minute, why what has happened represents a significant historical and a revolutionary moment as opposed to just an important historical moment. I think what I'm talking about is that a new world is being born before our eyes. A new world is being born before our eyes. And I think, yes, there you're absolutely correct. The French Revolution is an apt comparison with what has happened in the Arab world in the last. A new world is being born before our eyes, even though we do not know the shape of this world that's emerging. We don't know the dominant features of this world. We don't know how viable, how democratic, how durable, how inclusive, how pluralistic this world that's emerging, that has emerged in the last year or so. Please remember, it's essential for us, whether we are students or whether we are military officers, not to look at the Arab world as a unique place. That is, this is just one step in a long journey. And I think in the same way that we looked at Latin America in the 1990s, or Eastern Europe from 1980s and 1990s, or Indonesia in the 1990s, we must realize this is the first step in a very complex and complicated journey. That is one of the points I want to put on the table here today. That is, if transitions, global transitions, serve as a guide, we're talking about decades as opposed to months or years. The question is not, has Egypt emerged into a pluralistic society? The question for us, how long will take Egypt and Tunisia, the two most equipped states, to make it? How long will it take? My argument, and I'm not saying anything original here, it will take probably 2 or 3 decades to make the transition to pluralism as opposed to democracy. We're not talking about democracy yet, because democracy is a different matter. We can talk about the difference between pluralism and democracy. But I think another point I want to make, even though this is a complex and complicated journey, is that we are seeing the crumbling, the beginning of the crumbling of the official authoritarian world in the Arab world. And this is a very important point to highlight, because this particular wall, iron wall, has been erected for the last 60 years. And I think we are beginning, in this, not in a similar way to the Berlin Wall, because the Berlin Wall crumbled overnight because of the pressure. In the Arab world, and this wall has been there for 60 years, it's beginning to crumble. And yet, we do not know what kind of world or universe will replace this iron wall. And the reason why I'm stressing the significant historical and revolutionary nature of this particular moment, because I think President Barack Obama is correct to say that this is a moment of self-determination. You might say, what are you talking about? I mean, the Arabs have been free of colonialism since the 1940s. It is a moment of self-determination because, I mean, some of you might think that somehow, I mean, look what has happened, the so-called 350 million Arabs who inhabit the Arab world. they were ruled by the Ottoman Empire for 500 years. The Ottoman Empire was one of the greatest multi-ethnic, multinational empire that collapsed in 1918, yet it had survived for 500 years, and the Arab provinces were ruled from either Ankara or Istanbul. So for 500 years, the people we call the Arabs were ruled from either Ankara or Istanbul as subjects people, minorities, ethnicities, whatever. World War I ended, the Ottoman Empire collapsed. You would have expected the so-called the Arab people to be given, the right, the opportunity for self-determination. And in fact, President Wilson was the only world leader in 1980 who called on the world to allow colonized people to be free. And again, this is a historical point. So the debate between 1918 and 1923 whether the colonized people, including the Arab people, would have the opportunity to be free. And of course, the colonial moment replaced the Ottoman Empire, that President Wilson lost the argument for a variety of reasons. Whether he became ill, the Congress did not really buy the program, and Britain and France and Italy and other powers decided that that part of the world was not really equipped to govern itself. So what I'm saying is that in 1918, between 1918 and 1923, the so-called the Arab people, instead of given the opportunity for self-determination, basically came under the direct rule of the colonial powers. 1918, the end of the 1940s, the end of World War II. This was when basically the colonial moment was shattered as a result of World War II and the emergence of the United States and the Soviet Union as the dominant great powers. Unfortunately for the Arab people, instead of being given the opportunity for self-determination, the most dominant institution in that part of the world were the security forces, in particular the armies, because the colonial powers did not really invest much resources in civil society. Most of the investment between 1918 and the late 1940s were made by the colonial powers in the security services, because they wanted to rule, to control, they wanted to manage the states. And as a result, at the end of the 1940s, the man on the horseback in the Arab world emerged as the dominant player, as the dominant actor in Arab politics. And initially, just as a qualification, the man on the horseback was very popular, because the man on the horseback promised what? It promised liberation from colonialism. It promised modernization and development. It promised, of course, transition from backwardness to development. So the legitimacy of the man on the horseback, what I'm talking about, the military, was based on the idea to deliver the goods, to basically expel the colonialists, modernize, basically, and bring Arab society to the 20th century. And initially, in the first 2 decades, 1940s, 1950s, early 1960s, whether it was Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt or the various military officers who came to power in Iraq, in Syria, in Sudan, and of course in the late 1990s in Libya, basically their legitimacy was not based on the ballot box, was based on the idea that basically they would deliver the goods. They would basically create effective economies and societies. By the mid-1960s, the man on the horseback lost the legitimacy, basically, because, after all, they were unable to deliver the goods for their people. They basically turned the military coup d'etat that basically occurred in the 1940s into military dictatorships. Even Gamal Abdel Nasser, by the 1960s, one of the most, you might say, popular Arab leader, basically lost a great deal of legitimacy, in particular in 1967, and I don't have the time to really highlight. The military officers who promised heaven delivered almost dust. They could not even provide security for the homeland. Here you have a dynamic small state. Israel was able to defeat the most powerful army in the Arab world, Egypt. You can imagine the shattering of the system, the shattering, in fact, I will argue, the crumbling of the legitimacy of man on the horseback really came on the morning on 6 June, when Israel attacked Egypt and Syria and destroyed their forces. That was really the beginning of the end of the legitimate context under which military rulers came to power in the region. What I'm trying to say is that from the late 1960s up to the present, the existing system basically was running on empty. It was running on empty because it lost even the meager legitimacy that it had in the 1950s. They were really governing, most of the system that existed in the Arab world were governing basically by force and coercion as opposed to political legitimacy. And what I'm trying to say is that, in fact, the question for us is not why the Arab revolts basically have taken place. The question for many of us is that why they have taken so long to take place in the Arab world, given the fact, if my argument correct, if the system lost its legitimacy at the end of the 1960s, that is, the shattering defeat of the armed armies at the hands of a dynamic small state. The question for all of us, why, what explains the ability of authoritarian systems to exist for almost, I mean, think about it, 1967 up to 2011. This is by itself a testament to the durability and brutalness of the system that existed in that part of the world. And another point I want to make, the third point I want to make, is that in this particular sense, given the fact, for 600 years, this is a moment of self-determination, a psychological rupture has taken place in that part of the world. You cannot understand really what has happened except by understanding the psychological meaning. And in this particular sense, when I say a psychological rupture, because it's the first time in 600 years, the 350 million Arabs now feel free or on basically the verge of being free, determining their own affairs, taking ownership of their own destiny. And even though it's the beginning as opposed to the middle or the end of the road, but the psychological rupture tells us a great deal that the politics of the past will not really dominate that part of the world. And of course, I'm going to come back to the resistance that basically the new moment faces. But this psychological rupture will likely, in my estimate, changes the nature of politics. That's why I call it a new era of politics and economics with a question mark, because it's a question mark. And the question, as you know, as I suggested a minute ago, is that why the crisis, why the revolts have taken place now. And that is the only really, and here I'm simplifying, I hope you know, I'm simplifying a great deal. I just want to give you a glimpse of the context that existed in the Arab world from the late 1960s to the present. I think it is fair to say that what existed in the Arab world up till recently is that failed economies and failed political systems. Failed economies and failed political systems. Economy. Let's talk about the economy of the Arab world. And I'm not talking about the oil-producing states, Gulf states. I'm talking about the non-oil-producing states. You don't have economies, formal economies in the Arab world. In the same way we teach economics in the classrooms. You don't have capitalism, and you don't even have socialism. What you have in the Arab world, you have a type of what we call crony capitalism. Crony capitalism is that you're talking about tiny minorities. You have the state, the inner circle, and you have a very tiny, small parasite community that basically feeds on the state apparatus itself. In this particular sense, it's a very tiny, small circle elite, business elite, security elite, and does not allow, for example, if you have a great Egyptian entrepreneur, young man or woman, who would like to open business, the young Egyptian man or woman cannot go to a bank and ask for a loan in the same way that an American young man and woman do. Because the money you're talking about, the economy itself, is really controlled by a very small, tiny elite. And basically, there is no... to give you an idea, in the last 10 years, the Egyptian economy was growing by almost between 7 and 9%, one of the highest growth rates in the world. Yet, no trickle-down effects out of this particular growth to the Egyptian population. The same thing in Tunisia, same thing in Libya, the same thing in Syria and other societies. In fact, in the last 10 years, as the Egyptian economy was growing, poverty was also increasing in Egypt. Out of the 85 million Egyptian, you have almost 50%, between 43 and 50%, who live either in poverty or below the poverty line, that is on less than $2 a day. Almost 40 million Egyptians who live on less than $2 a day. And in particular, in the last 10 years, the poverty became extremely harsher, and more people fell into poverty. Failed political systems. The system that existed, the authority, it's one thing, Larry and I were talking about it tonight, it's one thing if you have an authoritarian political system and delivers the good. In the case of the Arab world, you have political oppression, you have abject poverty, and you have failed political system, closed political system that failed to integrate the rising social classes into the political space. In this particular sense, the system itself failed not only to deliver the goods, the bread and butter, it failed to have an opening whereby the millions of young men and women, and here we're going to talk about the demographics of the area, on average, 60% of the 350 million Arabs are below the ages 25 years old. This is a huge, one of the greatest constituency probably in world history in terms of young men and women. By the way, in Iran is the same way. More than 65% of the Iranian population basically under the ages of 25 years old. So in this particular sense, also to give you an idea, when we say failed political system and failed economies, in the 1950s, Egypt was ahead of Japan. Many economists used to say that, in fact, the median income in Egypt was ahead of Japan and the tigers, the four tigers in Asia. That Egypt could have been the Japan of the Middle East, yet look where Egypt is today as a result of political economy, as a result of the politics and the economics of governance, and of course, as a result of foreign policy and wars that have basically done a great deal of damage. Not only you don't have formal economies, not only you have, failed political system, even the states themselves, the state structures, the formal institutions collapsed in many countries in the Arab world. Again, I don't have the time to highlight what I mean, the state. Think about it. The man on the horseback came on the idea of what in the 1940s? They wanted to unify the nation. They wanted to expel colonialism. They wanted to create an organic unity in the Arab world. They wanted to mold all the ethnic and religious communities into one whole. That was the idea. That was a tall order. Look at where we are in 2011. In fact, I would argue not only we didn't have economies, formal economies, and formal political system, the formal state structures basically were decimated. In fact, an argument can be made, and at the risk of exaggeration, one can say that the states in the Arab world had been replaced by family-based states. The formal states in the Arab world had been replaced by family-based state. And if I were crude enough, I would say by mafia family-based states. So what do you have in Syria today? You have a family-based state. That is the Assad family-based state. What did you have in Libya till recently? You had the Gaddafi family-based state. All my respect for the officers, any officers from Yemen. What do you have in Yemen? You have a family-based, the Ali Abdullah Saleh, and the family, the son and the nephews and the cousins and the inner circle. Egypt. Egypt is one of the greatest and oldest states in the world. You have China and you have Egypt, 5,000 years. Egyptians call Egypt Dunya, the mother of the world, and rightly so. Yet, at one point, many Egyptians were joking about a family base that is the greatest and the oldest nation state in the world, the Dunya, the mother of the world, was replaced by the Mubarak family. That's how bad it is, the Arab world. And think about the unity, the organic unity that was promised by the man on the horseback. Now you have, the greatest poison in the Arab world today is not foreign intervention, is not, in fact, poverty. I would say it's sectarianism. Sectarianism, the new poison that's threatening the very survival of the state themselves, of the communities, whether you're talking about Bahrain or Iraq or Syria or Lebanon or what have you. The state themselves are collapsing from within, and provincial loyalties are taking over. In fact, sectarianism has become the new sword used and abused by Arab states against their enemies. This is how bad the situation is. What I'm trying to say, another point I want to make, is that no, we did not underestimate the structural crisis. This is a structural crisis that has been taking place for 4 decades. Never. Truly, most of us have been barking, including myself here at this podium, about the structural crisis. What we underestimated was the role of agency. The role of agency, because myself and many others never believed in our really wildest dreams that you have people basically rise up against these bloody dictators, whether in Libya or Syria or Yemen or even in Tunisia, because the security apparatus was so deeply entrenched. We did not believe that really young men and women would have the daring and the stamina and the human spirit to rise up. That's what we underestimated. And that's why, to come back to my central argument, is that regardless of how complex, how complicated the journey will be, the psychological rupture that has taken place, the role of agency is here with us to stay. And this role of agency will likely play a critical role. I just came back from Syria. I crossed from Lebanon. I didn't cross on my American passport. I crossed on my local Lebanese ID. I can tell you, even the heart of Damascus, Syria has changed, fundamentally changed. I mean, the killing goes on, yet people rise up, people every day. And this is by itself a testament truly to what has happened. And you cannot, and I urge you to just really conceptualize, imagine this world where the role of agency, the human spirit, and it's not just about freedom, and I'm going to talk about it a bit, but I think the role of agency, even though the crisis was not just about, freedom, it's about, socioeconomic crisis. I hope I highlighted in a very simplistic way. When on average in the Arab world, when people think of the Arab people, they think somehow that the Arabs are synonymous with the oil-producing Gulf states. Yet, on average, we have between 40 and 50% of the 350 million Arabs who live in poverty, either poverty or below the poverty line. That is, you have millions of Egyptians. Again, I come back to Egypt, because Egypt really is the central player in the region, because Egypt is the most populous Arab state. It's the capital of the cultural production of the Arab world. Millions of Egyptians who wait for hours for 6 loaves subsidized bread for the last few years. You have the Egyptian army had to intervene more than once to have its own bakeries to provide basics for Egyptians. This is how bad the situation is. In Yemen, the poverty rate is over 60%. You have demographics. Even the population growth, as I said, 60% of the population are under the ages 25 years old. You're talking about socioeconomic crisis, and in particular in the last 10 years. The poverty rate and the suffering and the social crisis has intensified a great deal. And of course, you know all about the food prices and the increase in food prices as a result of multiple challenges, which really affected that part of the world in a great deal. So in many ways, it's not just about freedom in the sense of freedom divorced from economic vulnerabilities, from survival. I think we cannot understand what has happened without looking at the complexity, the whole thing. And it's not just about, goods and services. It's about the fact that the reason why, and I'm trying to provide you with just a bit of context, that is, you have also globalization that has reached that part of the world. It's not just about Facebook, it's not about the internet, and because very few people in that part of the world have access to the internet for a variety of reasons. In fact, if there is one particular point that I would like to highlight here about why now, you have to understand what I call the Al Jazeera effect. The Al Jazeera effect, that is the rise of Al Jazeera and the satellite television stations in the Arab world, huge audiences. You're talking about, on average, 50 million Arabs turn to hear news from Al Jazeera or various television stations. What Al Jazeera has done is to break the government monopoly on the flow of information. in particular since the late 1990s. Before the late 1990s, Arab governments were able to dominate, to really basically dominate the news outlets. Egyptians and Tunisians and Syrians and Yemenis did not have access to the free flow of information. What Al Jazeera did since the late 1990s was to break this particular monopoly of governments, and thus to really tell the story of what's happening within Arab societies themselves. Of course, Al Jazeera has its own take. Al Jazeera has its own, on foreign policy, it's an entirely different take. But in the case of domestic politics, Al Jazeera has been telling Egyptians what the Mubarak family had been doing for many years, what Gamal Mubarak was doing, what the Mubarak wife was doing, the shopping sprees in Milano and Paris and London. Al Jazeera was also to tell the story about the wealth that has been siphoned off, about the systemic nature of corruption. Again, I talked about failed economies and crony capitalism. What I did not mention to you, and you know, that corruption was not just part, of the political and economic structure. Corruption was systemic. Corruption was systemic. In fact, corruption was a way of life. We estimate, just again, I don't have the time to give you the numbers. The wealth of the family-based estates, nobody knows the extent of the wealth, because as you know, there's a great deal of speculation. We don't know what was the fortune of the Gaddafi's wife, whether it's $30 billion or $3 billion. We don't know the wealth of the Gaddafi's sons. Give and take, 20, 30, 40 billion dollars. We still don't know the wealth of the Mubarak family. It ranges, the estimates we have, from 70 billions to 3 billions, give and take. Saleh, Ali Abdullah Saleh, one of the poorest, well, it's the poorest country, not one of the poorest Arab country. Again, the estimates are in the billions of dollars. So you have systemic corruption, and you have abject poverty. That is, 60% of the Yemeni people basically live in abject poverty, while the family and the inner circle basically have billions of dollars siphoned away in various banks. And in this particular sense, this brings me to the challenges. I want to say a few words about the challenges facing the Arab awakenings. Even though, and I hope I don't mislead you in any way, even though this is a great historical moment, even though this is really a psychological rupture has taken place in the Arab world, I think there are some major risks and vulnerabilities. And I think from what I have said so far, probably you will be able, I'm sure you have already at least taken the major critical challenges and risks facing the region. That is, the first and the most important risk and challenge facing the Arab world in this journey, the journey transitioning from absolute authoritarianism to pluralism and then to institutional democracy, is what I call fragile institutions. In fact, non-existent institutions. I could go further and be really provocative and say that in many parts of the Arab world, and I think probably this would be a very harsh statement, that we're talking about an institutional wasteland. The Arab world is an institutional wasteland. Take Egypt, for example. Egypt in 1923 had one of the most progressive constitutions in the world, as progressive as the American Constitution. And I hope you take a look at, again, I don't have the time to really flesh out what the Egyptian Constitution of 1923 included. As progressive as the American Constitution. The Egyptian Constitution has been mutilated since 1952. It's non-existent. Now, well, you have family-based estate, if my reading is correct. How do you replace the family-based estate with how do you build institutions? Again, I don't need to tell you how difficult it is to build institutions from the bottom up, block by block. On average, we estimate, political theorists, it takes about 80 years to build and consolidate institutions. It has taken the United States more than 80 years, actually, and various European countries. Again, we're not talking about democracy, we're talking about institutional building. And when I say institutional building, you're talking about resolving the great debates in society about the kind, I mean, think of the great debates unfolding in the Middle East today. The role of the army in politics, whether it's parliamentarian system, presidential system, how do they distribute power, who controls the parliament, the role of the army. How do you resolve these questions? How do you, because remember, in the absence of institutions, institutions mediate conflict between, I mean, individuals and agents. When you don't have institutions, how do you mediate great conflicts in society? What do you do? How do you build the institutions in the absence of a shared common thread? I mean, again, I don't have the time to flesh out. In Egypt, in Tunisia, in Syria, in Libya, in every single country, the greatest fault line that has emerged is not about the rise of the Islamists to power, and I would be delighted to answer any question you have, is what I call the secular religious divide. That is, you have the basic fault line between liberal, nationalist, secular forces and Islamists. And this particular fault line now is playing itself out on the Egyptian really streets. The young activists and the Democrats and the liberals who really played a key role in the Egyptian revolt, basically find themselves disinherited now after the rise of the Islamists, who won almost 70% of parliamentary seats. Seculars and liberals in Egypt, if you go to Egypt, and in particular the celebration of the anniversary, it was a very sad moment for many of us to see young activists and liberals and seculars bemoaning basically that the Islamists have stolen the show, hijacked the moment, that they played a key role in the awakening, yet the Islamists basically now have a dominant majority, and the Islamists and the military in Egypt, according to liberals, basically are flirting in order to create an unholy alliance. That's what liberals tell you. We don't know, I mean, whether it's accurate or not, that's not the question. But you have a huge fault line that has emerged in Tunisia between religious activists on the one hand and liberal seculars. How do you create institutions in the absence of a particular, I mean, common shared values in societies? So fragile institution is a huge task. How long will it take? Probably 2 decades, 3 decades, in order for the building process to take place. Socioeconomic crisis. How do you create institutions while you have, I mean, millions of people who live in abject poverty? Literally abject poverty. Again, I want to come back to Egypt because I really want to hammer this. I mean, I forget about Yemen. There is no economy in Yemen. In Syria, there's hardly any. There is no productive base in Egypt. I mean, how do you, Egypt today, and I hope my Egyptian counterparts would really ask, you know, help us understand. I mean, Egypt is almost bankrupt now, literally bankrupt. Egypt at this particular stage does not really have resources to pay the salaries. If it's bureaucracy, lack of butter, wheat, this is how bad it is. Its foreign currency is down to 10 billion out of $40 billion. I mean, running so low. The lack of confidence in the Egyptian economy because of the political struggle that's taken place. So how do you build productive bases given the great political struggles that are unfolding in Egypt and other places? How do you do it? Again, it's a major problems given the context of the economic vulnerabilities. Not only that, if my reading is correct, if a psychological rupture has taken place, the pollings that we have seen in the last 70% of Arabs believe that their quality of life will improve in a year or so as a result of the Great Awakenings. 70%. In fact, the reality is their quality of life will likely deteriorate in the next 1 or 2 or 3 years, given the social and political toll. So you have huge expectations, and you have dismal socioeconomic conditions. You have a huge now, I mean, the role of agency in politics. You have millions of young men and women who basically dream of a better life. They have access. They think, you know, our life is going to improve. Mubarak is not out there, yet their life will not improve because there is so little out there in terms of a productive base. The demographics the explosion in the Arab world, I think it's one of the most dangerous development, because when I say, 60% out of the 350 million Arabs, let's say 100 million young men, how do you feed them? How do you educate them? How do you help them to, huge, huge crisis, truly. Again, if you go to Cairo, you go to the urban poverty belts in Cairo where you have 10 million people who live in abject poverty. How do you deal with these conditions that exist and the transitions? And there's a fear and danger that you have populism now. A Messiah would emerge out of it and say, I promise you. And we know in transition there is a real danger, because historically speaking, in similar situations, it's very easy for populism to emerge and promise deliverance for their societies. How do you deal with the army's expanding appetite for power? You've seen, this is, of course, revolts have taken place. We're seeing the second phase now. And bluntly, how do you balance the army's fears that somehow they need to protect their institution? They need to maintain, control over their own affairs with the rising aspirations of millions of people. How do you do it? Again, Egypt, tells us a great deal that the role of the army, and remember, this is not about whether the army is right or wrong, that's not the question. It's also about the nature of the state. When Egyptians say, we would like the army to relinquish power to an elected civilian authority, millions of Egyptians are saying, we would like a government, basically, that the army, civilian must have control over the army affairs. The army says, we don't trust a civilian government emerging out of the turmoil. We want to control our own affairs. Again, it tells you a great deal about the challenges. How do you balance the army's, basically, fears as an institution with the people's aspirations to really move into a new era, a transparent, open, civilian-based system? Not only you have lack of world leadership. In the case of Latin America, in the case of Indonesia in the 1990s, in the case of Eastern Europe, there was a great deal of embrace of the revolts that basically against communism. The West really fully embraced the revolts. And I think in the case of the Middle East, I would say the international community, even though belatedly, has basically welcomed the great development. In particular, the United States. President Barack Obama has really tried to realign American foreign policy with the rising aspirations in the Arab world. His speech in May 2011, I think, was a pivotal speech. He basically said that the United States will deal with the democratic aspirations of the Arab people, will respect the aspirations, will support the Egyptian and the Tunisians as the first, cases. Rhetoric. No major initiatives, no major material packages to that part of the world. And that's complicates the process of transition. Not only we don't have money, the United States, as you know, Larry mentioned my new book, The Rise and Fall of Al-Qaeda by Oxford University Press. We have spent on average between $3 and $5 trillion in direct and indirect costs between 2001 and the present. Most of the money, borrowed money. So we don't have money. Europe doesn't have money because they have their own crisis. But I think American foreign policy, this is not the time. I have a new book coming out on U.S. foreign policy in May. I think U.S. foreign policy priorities are being shifted to somewhere else, to Asia and the Pacific Ocean. That the Middle East is no longer really the priority, the strategic priority theater for the United States. In particular, I'm not talking about the oil producing. I'm talking about that part of the world. That is, the United States has a full plate. Even on the Arab-Israeli conflict, President Barack Obama's speech in September 2011 basically said, you go away, you do it, you resolve it yourselves. It tells you a great deal. Not only we don't have the money to provide, to give, but I don't think there is global leadership that basically provides leadership because the money is there. The greatest cash flow in the world is not in China and the East. It's in the Middle East, by the way. Cash flow a great deal, tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars that can be invested in a very fruitful way. But you need a global leadership to really create a grand vision in order to invest, as opposed, nobody is saying, let's give the government, the newly established government, money. But let's help, let's invest in reconstruction. And I think the return on investment would be great. But there is, it seems to me, lack of global leadership in the same way in comparison to Latin America and Eastern Europe. And this, in this particular sense, what I'm trying to say is that the Arabs are on their own. The Egyptian Prime Minister, a few weeks ago, Al-Janzouri, he went to the public, after the second uprising or revolts against the military. He said, look, Egypt was promised $10 billion, hardly only $500 million came out from Qatar. No money. Our Gulf states, American money has not reached Egypt. I have no magical wand, he said. The first time ever he was appointed by the ruling generals. Again, this tells you a great deal. How do you do the transition? How do you rebuild institutions? How do you deal with the unfolding great political struggle? How do you provide the goods and services while there's no money, not only in the region coming, but also there is no global leadership to help you transition? Let me conclude. How much time do I have, Larry? I see. 5 minutes? All right. I hope I started by saying this is a great historical moment, a great revolutionary moment. Now you get how complex and how difficult, even though on the psychological, it really is. For most of us, it's so wonderful to see finally the pluralistic revolt reaching the Arab lands after so many years of authoritarianism and autocracy. Because remember, in many ways, the system that existed not only bled their societies dry, the autocratic system that existed also nourished extremism. The migration of extremism from the... In fact, I'm one of the students, I'm one of the region, that given the context, given the really dismal socioeconomic crisis, I'm one of the people who have argued constantly in the last 10 years that I was pleasantly surprised how little violence there was in that part of the world. Truly, if the same conditions had existed in other regions of the world, you'll have, I would say, an ocean of blood, fire and blood. Given the desperation, the lack of hope, in fact, that part of the world was not the most dangerous neighborhood in the world. That part of the world, historically speaking, I'm talking as a historian, was one of the least violent regional systems in the world, given how the depth of the crisis that existed in that part of the world. Because extremism itself, that system nourishes, the nature of the system, the way that it oppressed its people on multiple levels could have given really rise to forces, to extremist forces, and it did. And that the migration of militancy reached American shores on 9/11. And I don't think you can really understand, truly, the rise of what I call militant forces in the Arab world throughout the 1990s up to the present without understanding what I call the political and institutional context. The political and institutional context that has given rise to militant forces. And that's why many of us hope, Larry cited one of my paragraphs, that is basically the transition of Arab societies. In fact, if and when the transitions basically succeed, this deliver the final nail in the coffin, not just of Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is a tiny fringe faction, but the whole idea of extremism. And I started by saying I'm not worried about the rise of the Islamists to power in Tunisia and Egypt, because as you all know, the Islamists have traveled a long journey so far. Most of the Islamist forces that the Muslim Brotherhood, the Renaissance Party, Al-Nahda in Tunisia, Al-Adl wal-Ihsan in Morocco, and various Islamists, they accept the rules of the political game. For the last 40 years or so, they have been really engaged in the political process. They have labored very hard to be accepted as a political force. They have renounced violence. They renounced violence since the late 1960s, early 1970s. In fact, the Islamists in the Arab world, and as some of us, and of course we are speculating, they're really walking a similar journey to their Turkish counterparts, it seems to me, with minor differences. And I think the engagement, the political engagement of the Islamists in the Arab world will likely, I would submit to you, witness what I call the secularization of Muslim politics. We might witness in the same way that Indonesia and Turkey and Malaysia have witnessed a similar process. In the Arab world, we see the Muslim Brotherhood traveling a similar journey to their counterparts, even though it's going to take them 10 years or so. But I'm not worried about the Islamists in Egypt or Tunisia or Morocco hijacking the revolutions, because there are multiple divisions and tensions and links within the Islamists, and also because there are checks and balances in the Arab world. The Muslim Brotherhood knows very well that the army is there. There are checks and balances. They cannot hijack they're not immature, they're not dumb. They realize what the game is. And that's why the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, that won more than 40% of seats in the parliament, has basically decided to not to go on the streets and revolt and protest against the army, because they realize the stakes are very big for them. And they realize, I don't have the time to talk about the history, what happened between 1952 and 1954, when the Muslim Brotherhood decided to challenge the Gamal Abdel Nasser and the free officers, and basically they were almost decimated. The Muslim Brotherhood challenge of the army, the blessed officers, between 1952 and 1954 almost brought about the end of the Muslim Brotherhood as an institution. And that institutional memory is alive and well. And that's why the Muslim Brotherhood will go to the greatest lengths not to basically, in my estimate, based on what I know, not to really basically challenge the army in Egypt. But this is, in a way, it does not really serve the transition, because you don't want any kind of an alliance between the army in Egypt and the Muslim Brotherhood. You want the political game to unfold. You want the struggle. You might say, why the secular forces, why the liberals have not done very well. In fact, not only they have not done well, they have done dismally in Tunisia, in Morocco, in Egypt, and they will do so in Syria and Libya and Jordan, everywhere else. I don't need to tell you, because I think while the autocratic governments were able to really destroy the secular and liberal voices in the last 40 years, they have not been able to do so with the Islamists. The Islamists had their mosques. The liberals and the seculars did not really have any kind of an institutional home. And also many of the liberal and nationalist forces decided to basically align their causes with the existing autocratic system. They have been discredited and undermined by their close relationship with the autocratic government. And also, liberal and secular forces in the Arab world, basically their message is a bit elitist. Well, not a bit elitist, it's elitist. You go to Cairo or Tunisia, they sit in their air conditioning offices, they hardly go to the countryside, their messages don't resonate, they don't have a blueprint, while the Islamists, what? They live in the neighborhoods. If you want to go and interview the Islamists, as some of us have done in the last 20 years, you have to go to Imbaba, to Madinat Salam in Egypt. They are part of local politics. The reason why the Islamists won, because local politics, as we know here in the United States, it's all about local politics. People voted for the Islamists, I want you to know, in Tunisia and Morocco and Egypt, not because they want an Islamic Emirat. They voted for the Islamists because they wanted to make a clean break with the past. Because they trust the Islamists, because they're part of the local milieu. And you remember my words, and I hope I am right. If the Islamists don't deliver the goods, and most probably they won't, because they don't have the ideas, they will be voted out in 4 years, in the same way that they're voted in now. So the fact is that Islamists have won majorities in our parliament is not a testament to basically, you cannot at this moment, because this is a transition moment, you cannot make a statement about why Islamists won, that's it. Because I think at the end of the day, the fortune of the Islamists in the Arab world will basically ebb and flow, depending on their ability to basically not only deliver the goods, but also deliver, be truthful to the message that they have, given the Arab people about pluralism, about transparency, about economic efficacy, about respecting the constitutional and diversity of the Arab political and social milieu. So in this particular sense, and my fear, I'm not worried that the Islamists have won parliamentary seats. I'm worried that the Islamists have no ideas. The body has expanded a huge deal in the last 4 decades. Unfortunately, the brain has not really kept pace with the body, that the brain is still very small. They don't have any kind of original creative ideas. My fear is that they will fail given the challenges facing the Arab world. And this is bad for both the Islamists and the Arab societies because in the next 10 years, are bound to be very, very turmoil. Let me conclude just giving you an idea of what I think. I think of all the Arab states, of course, Tunisia and Egypt are the most equipped to make the transition in the next decade. I'm not worried about Egypt, even though the challenges in Egypt are tremendous, are really striking on multiple levels, because Egypt has always been a pivotal state. You have a critical mass of civil society, truly. This is a giant society. And I think it might take Egypt 10 years or so, but will likely be able to find its way. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be smooth. It's my hope, I hope, that really the United States and the international community will provide support to Egyptians in order to really begin the process of putting their house in order. The transition, but what we are witnessing, and I don't think we should worry about protests on the streets. I think we're witnessing the return of politics. It's normal. This is turmoil, but it's wonderful to see Egyptians now debating their future. I think finally the Egyptians in the last, because I mean, if you look at the 1920s or 1930s, Egypt, there was a great deal of politics in Egypt in the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s. Since the early 1950s, since the Egyptian coup and revolution of 1952, I think basically politics disappeared for a variety of reasons. Because first you had military legitimacy, and now then, of course, you had dictatorship. So Egypt and Tunisia, even though the transition is going to be very hectic, very difficult, very complex, very messy, and there will be setbacks. We have already witnessed setbacks, but I think these two states will most probably make it in the next 10 years, I hope, with the support of the international community. Syria, my take on Syria is that Syria has already descended into prolonged conflict. Call it, I mean, so far, it's the beginning of civil war. I think the peaceful protests are turning more and more violent by the hour and by the day. I don't see Assad's days numbers as the conventional wisdom has it. And I would be delighted to talk about why I don't see the end of the Syrian crisis in the next few weeks or next few months. I think there's a standoff, stalemate between the Assad regime and the opposition. I think there are several points I want to put it on the table, very simplistic points. I think Assad retains a sizable base of support. Between 25 and 40% of Syrians still support the Assad regime. This is a sizable number of support. The security forces has remained united despite the defections. The defections still very low, very small numbers. We're talking about hundreds as opposed to thousands. Thirdly, the regime itself has the political will to fight to the bitter end. This is not Gaddafi, by the way. There is no, he knows, Assad and the inner circle and the family, that there is no way out. This is a fight to the bitter end, and they have the will, and I don't think we have witnessed the end of it in terms of the violence. We have seen a glimpse of the violence in Syria. I mean, I think the next few months will likely be much bloodier and much brutal. The regional context favors Assad, as you well know, despite the circle that's been tightening on Assad. You have an open route now from Tehran to Baghdad to Damascus. In fact, Iraq has emerged as one of the major players providing Assad with sustenance. Iran does not view the context in Syria in terms of an uprising. Iran views the context in Syria as part of a new Cold War. The survival of the Assad regime is existential to Iran. As long as Assad can pay the salary of his security forces, I think the fight goes on. And of course, as long as the Russians are willing to prevent a Security Council. What I'm trying to say is that I don't see a way out in Syria at this particular moment. I don't see what the tipping point, even though I don't see how Assad can survive in the long term. I have no doubts in my mind that Assad will go. How long will it take? What will be the cost to Syria and its neighbors? Will Syria remain a unified state? Will it descend into great chaos? It's very, for a person like me who talks to many Syrians from many, it's a very alarming situation. I had never seen Syria as polarized on multiple fault lines. Forget the people tell you that Assad is just an Alawite minority regime. In fact, many Christians in Syria are much more fanatical about Assad than the Alawites. The Christians I talk to, they think it's existential survival for them. The bourgeoisie class in Assad fully is invested in the Assad regime. The merchant class, the Sunni merchant class, which is a major merchant class in Damascus and Aleppo, still fully support the Assad regime. So it's not just the Alawites, his base. His base is a bit broader than we think. So I don't see where the tipping point, even though there are signs that the uprising is spreading, that the security forces are thinning. I mean, even though he has about 200, he has mobilized, and he will be able to mobilize up to 300,000 forces. But now you can go from Dar'a to Idlib to Deir ez-Zor to Damascus to Jisr al-Shughur to Homs to Hama. I mean, you need a lot of forces, and he cannot afford to send the regular army because there is a danger that the regular army itself will likely splinter so he won't send the regular army. So the tipping point, I don't think the tipping point will come from the international community. I think the tipping point will likely come in particular from this psychological rupture and the spreading of the uprising in Syria. Because they cannot afford, many Syrians say they cannot afford to go home because they realize they would be decimated in the same way that Hama was. And that's why, in fact, the more Assad kills his own people, the more potent the uprising becomes. In the case of Libya and Yemen, I think we don't know. I am one of the persons, I don't know what's happening in Libya. There is no sense of the nation in Libya. That's the problem. I mean, if you go to Tripoli, to give you just an anecdote, you arrive at Tripoli airport. You would expect, say, Libya welcome you to, or Tripoli. So the biggest sign at Tripoli airport, Az-Zuntan welcome you to Libya. Az-Zuntan is a militia, is a brigade, is a town in Syria, and they control the airport. So Az-Zuntan controls the airport, Az-Zuntan owns the airport. Misrata owns Misrata, so Saif al-Islam is being, I mean, he's Misrata. Benghazi is the same way. Regionalism is deeply entrenched as opposed, I don't know, out of the regional and tribal cleavages will emerge a sense of, because again, I don't have the time to flesh out. The sense of a nation in Libya is a very thin, and whatever existed was destroyed by Gaddafi. He manipulated regional and tribal loyalties in order to maintain, and that's why it seems to me that Libya is work in progress. Will Libya descend into, will the various, if you go to Tripoli, by the way, you have almost 24 militias control the various areas of Tripoli. So I don't see out of this messy regional councils and militias a sense of nationalism emerge in Libya. How long will it take? I mean, even you have Mustafa Abdel Jalil himself warning of a great civil war, all-out civil war in the country. When you have the leader of Libya saying, you know, we're almost on the brink, on the verge, that's very alarming. Could be early, somehow, I just don't know. I'm very alarmed by what I see, clashes on a daily basis. Even the French, I mean, now they pulled their, doctors and their human rights from many parts of Libya, including Misrata. We have very alarming reports on human rights violations on huge scales. The militias in various parts in Libya are basically doing similar things to what Gaddafi did, and on larger scales, actually, in terms of abuse and violation. Very, very alarming. Yemen, it's the beginning of, I mean, again, yes, President Ali Abdullah Saleh is out, but the system remains in place. The clashes continue. how will Yemen go? I mean, as you know, yesterday, in fact, the special forces fired on many soldiers because they were trying. I mean, I think this is a country in great turmoil. The reason why I'm not worried about Yemen as much as I am worried about Libya, because the tribes in Yemen serve, and I might come as a surprise to you, as a shadow government. The tribes really a force of stability in Yemen, as opposed to being instability, as a force of instability. And I think the United States is very much interested in Yemen, for a variety of reasons, because Yemen has one of the largest borders with Saudi Arabia. You have a very potent Al-Qaeda group in Yemen now. And there's a lot of interest in Yemen by the international community. But still, Yemen is messy. Yemen is very difficult to predict. You have multiple tribal and regional cleavages between the north and the south. Again, I don't have the time, but this is really the beginning of what we don't know. I don't think Yemen will, and Yemen is the poorest, when I say it's the poorest Arab country. Not only its oil is running out, its water, its very survival is at stake. That's how bad it is. But the fact is, I think the exit of Saleh is a good thing, but it's a very humble step because he left behind an apparatus. How long will it take for the new system to, it is not very difficult at all. Let me conclude, and it's my final 1 minute, by saying it is so wonderful for some of us to really, the first time probably in the last 40 years or so, and the reason why we're very hopeful, because these are indigenous movements, authentic movements, bottom up, inside out, as opposed to top down, external affected movements. I mean, I think you can compare the reason why the Iraq project failed, the reason why the American-led invasion, because it was a top down, outside in, as opposed now to really bottom up, inside out. And the beauty about what we have witnessed, they're really more focused, whether we can call them, I mean, bread and butter, quality of life, and freedom, liberation. They're focused on internal issues. One of the most pleasant things about what we have witnessed, we have not witnessed American flags being burned. We have what really not witnessed talks about Western colonialism and domination. Hardly. Not even Israel. Israel, amazingly, it really did not figure very big at all in what has happened. The focus has been on internal dynamics, focus on the internal tormentors. And this is very unique. This is very refreshing because for the last, as you all know, 20, 30 years, it was all about what the Western powers, the plots by the Western powers, what the United States was trying to do. This is truly represents a major shift in the focus of our public opinion, from foreign policy into the focus that they don't blame the West, they blame their own bloody dictators for bleeding their countries dry. Also, what's fascinating, what we have discovered, there is a middle class, there is what we call a middle opinion in that part of the world. And yes, the Islamists are a major player, but the Islamists are part of the mosaic of the political system. My take on it is that instead of keeping whining and complaining, the liberal and secular forces, they must really buckle up and begin the process of competing with their Islamist counterparts. I think the loss is good because now it shows how little investment they have made. We're not surprised that the Islamists have done as well as they have because they have invested a great deal of social capital in the last four decades. I think it's about time that the liberal and secular forces, compete with the Islamists, and I think their loss will likely motivate them to do so. And I think in this particular sense, even though the Islamists now own the moment, I think the reality of what we have witnessed, the reality of politics in that part of the world, really, this is a new opening. This is a new moment. It's a very pregnant moment. And I think it's the first time, really, in probably many, many years, as I mentioned, hundreds of years, that the people are trying to take ownership of their own destiny. Thank you.